Hello and welcome back. I'm Natalie MacDonald and you are watching the latest edition of Sydney Direct, which falls on RBA Rates Day. The central bank opted to maintain interest rates at that record low 2%. So I spoke to Katrina Ell at Moody's Analytics to find out the methodology and metrics behind this and where, more importantly, the Australian dollar is headed. Katrina Ell, thank you so much for joining us today. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, particularly on Rates Day.
It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. Okay, so firstly, let's walk through the methodology and metrics really behind that RBA decision to leave interest rates on hold at 2%.
Well, it wasn't a surprise move that they held steady because after cutting rates in May, we always expected them to remain on the sidelines for a few more months to kind of get a state of play and see how the economy's tracking, whether the unemployment rate's going to decline eventually, and they really want to see how things are going before they'll cut rates or decide to hold steady indefinitely.
Now, Glenn Stevens did name drop the US Fed in today's accompanying statement, but also argued that global financial conditions remain accommodative. Is it not the case, though, that if the RBA is actively positioning itself against sort of action that the US Fed may take, is that not in fact the opposite of accommodative?
Well, what we think is really going to happen is the Australian dollar is really going to be more influenced by what happens in the Fed, and so the exchange rate will move to be lower as the Fed starts to normalise rates rather than be influenced by kind of a to and fro between the central banks and what's happening in terms of different policy setting at the moment. So we think that because of that, the Australian dollar is going to head lower rather than if the Reserve Bank of Australia holds steady.
You mentioned there the Aussie dollar, and again, Mr. Stevens acted to jawbone that local currency lower, still saying that it's more likely and also necessary for the currency to continue to depreciate. We've asked those questions 1,000 times over the last year, but really, where does the central bank want that currency to be sitting ultimately?
That's a really good question, but one that's really hard to answer. What we think is fair value is probably another 4% depreciation against the US dollar. So that's having the Australian dollar sit at around 73 US cents. And it's likely that the Reserve Bank of Australia would actually like to see the currency fall below the 70 mark to really help the economy transition away from mining investment and towards domestic facing sectors. We've seen that the export sectors have been struggling in recent years because of lacking price competitiveness, and we think that a lower Australian dollar will help that rebalancing really take off.
The Governor did also touch on housing prices, but used a lot more moderate language than other discussion that we've heard today regarding an unequivocal housing market bubble. Really, where are we heading with this? Obviously, the RBA have said that they are monitoring the situation, but it certainly didn't have sort of the active, aggressive language that we're hearing from other bodies, really.
Well, the Reserve Bank of Australia is really taking a conservative approach by not calling the property market a bubble, if that's what it believes it is. Instead, they're kind of following the regulator, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, and staying quiet on what action they're actually taking to cool the worrying segments of the property market. And the main worrying segment is high investor participation in Sydney. And we expect that the regulator, alongside with the central bank, will introduce additional measures to cool the market, but we probably won't hear about that in public announcements because that's not their style. We'll probably hear that through anecdotal reports, and it's probably going to take a few more months to that for then, after those announcements, for that to filter through to lower property prices.
Katrina, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks.
That is all we've got time for. However, do stay tuned to Dukascopy TV, as the TV team will be bringing you plenty more exclusive insights and analysis concentrating on the FX markets. For now, though, it's goodbye from me.